Welcome, everyone. Thanks very much for joining my presentation on the mental health of a startup founder. This is a topic that I feel particularly strongly about, and it's something that I have not seen a lot of startup founders speak about publicly. And so I was passionate about putting this presentation together for the benefit of many of you who may be considering starting your own company or are living in a startup culture right now, managing some of the same feelings and emotions. So to start out, I'm just going to introduce myself briefly, give you a sense of where I'm coming from, so the rest of my presentation will make more sense. So as I mentioned, I have been passionate about this topic, and that's partly because from the beginning of my life, I've always been what I would describe as an anxious achiever, a brass ring chaser, if you will. I went to Harvard, Oxford, and Yale. I was the kid who was always first in my class, striving to get an A. What's the next prestigious thing? What's the next prestigious institution that I can wrap myself in so I can feel really good about myself? So my sense of self-worth has always been tied up in a continuous, steady drumbeat of achievement, essentially. And I think that's true of a lot of kids who are encouraged to do well in school and try their hardest and so forth. Many of us become entrepreneurs. I then started out my career as a lawyer. So I actually worked for one of the Supreme Court justices. This is David Souter at the United States Supreme Court, one of only 36 people who have this incredible opportunity in their careers. That's my daughter. At the time, she was very small. Now she's 17 years old. That's my wife. We've been together for 26 years. And there's the justice who loved to wear extremely long neckties. Justice Souter was a fantastic mentor, and I couldn't have had a better experience in the law. But after I finished my clerkship, I went on to become a law partner here in Denver, Colorado. And I started a practice in international arbitration where I tried cases all around the world and had a really fantastic experience as things go, as lawyers go. This was a great opportunity for me. And yet, I even as good as of an experience as it was, even though I made partner when I was 33 years old, I still felt like there was something missing in my life. Like I wanted a chance to do something more creative, something that was more challenging, more stimulating, and had a bigger impact on the world, maybe could make the world a better place. And so I quit at age 33. I turned in my spurs. I gave up my partnership. I took a 5X pay cut to become a tech entrepreneur. And this is the first time I'd ever started a real business. I tinkered here and there throughout college and law school, a couple nonprofit organizations, but I never ran a business. I never started a business before. So this meant I had no prior business school training. As you'll recall, I went to law school. I didn't know what it was like, any of the steps in raising money, coming up with an idea, building a team. I didn't have any technical training or expertise, so I don't know how to write software of any kind. And yet it just was really something I was determined to try, because to me, it felt like if I didn't give it a shot, I would never forgive myself. And I couldn't imagine continuing my life as a lawyer just in that same fashion every day, having clients that I serve for the next 20 or 30 years, but not really creating my own something, whether it's a work culture or a product. And so I took the plunge when I was about 33 years old, and I started this company, which is called Ibotta. And Ibotta is a cashback rewards platform. We give rewards in lieu of coupons for everyday purchases. And the company has grown substantially since then. Now, if you actually were to just read the headlines and look me up on Google, what you're going to see is a very particular version of me, the version that I want the outside world to see. And this is very commonly the case with all entrepreneurs. You get the kind of brochure version of the glorious life of the entrepreneur. And our society does this as well. You look at the way that people describe Elon Musk as like a Thomas Edison of our times, or watch a movie like The Social Network and watch how Hollywood depicts the experience of being a startup founder. And you see press like this, Ibotta becomes a tech unicorn, one of the first billion-dollar companies in Colorado, and I get to be on the cover, or I win a glamorous award like CEO of the Year, or even, my company's name is on the jersey of the New Orleans Pelicans, one of the most up-and-coming, exciting young NBA teams. And you see that and go, man, that guy's got it all figured out. That must be such an incredible career choice. I want to do something like that. And look, there are parts of this job that are just as good or better than advertised. And to be clear, nothing I say today changes the fact that it was one of the best decisions of my life to quit being a lawyer and to try to start something and become an entrepreneur. I wouldn't trade that. But I did not understand what it would entail and what it would take to be successful. And it's taken me over a decade to really process and digest that. And I kind of wish somebody had shared these thoughts with me when I was at the very beginning of my journey 10 years ago. So there's always more to the story. There's always more to the story. You don't really know what someone's lived experience is like. People are incredibly adept at obscuring that from you, particularly entrepreneurs, because they're all about creating an impression that they want you to take away about their company, the future. We're storytellers by nature. And one of the stories we tell is about ourselves and our path and our journey. The reason I have a picture of a pizza on the screen is that there's actually a restaurant here in Denver, Colorado called North. It's in Cherry Creek. And the restaurant is a dedicated restaurant where my wife and I go just to discuss the reasons why everything's going to be okay, so she can help talk me down off the ledge. This is a restaurant that I've been to 4 or 5 times where it seemed like there was no way out. This was it. The company had reached some sort of a wall or a dead end. And now what are we going to do? How are we going to carry the adventure forward from here? And part of the reason why we go to North every time is just sitting in that restaurant is a physical reminder that we figured it out last time. And so we'll probably find a way to figure it out again this time. And literally, I'll tell my wife, man, tough week, tough day at the office, this or that reversal of fortune. And she'll say, should I go ahead and make a booking at North? And I'll say, you probably ought to. So it's part of our relationship routine at this point. So I want to take you back in time to what it feels like when you're just at the beginning and coming up with an idea for a company. So what many people do is they try to find inspiration somewhere. They'll go online, they'll talk to other founders of companies, and they just really want to understand what was the hook. What was the moment of inspiration or insight? I don't have any good ideas. And yet these people who are out there, this class of founders, they seem to just have these brilliant original ideas and they know what to do with them. And I'm not like that. I can't figure it out like that. So I can't take that leap. And I felt like that when I was a lawyer, very much so. And like a lot of folks, I went on to Google and I just started looking for people who were recent success stories and see if I could glean something or relate to them in some way. This is a person called Aaron Patzer. Aaron was the founder of a company called Mint.com. And back when I started Ibotta in 2011, this was one of the recent success stories. And he had created this company out of thin air and inside of 3 years sold the company for $170 million. And he gave a Google presentation. It was about an hour long. It was a YouTube presentation rather, on his story. And his story mentioned in passing that it was the hardest thing he'd ever done, but most of the story was kind of the Superman narrative, as I like to call it. This is what I did, why it was disruptive, why it was so impactful, and how much money I made. And it's great to be me, basically. So when you watch something like this, it quickly goes from inspiration to intimidation as you think, gosh, I don't have a degree from graduate degree in computer science from Duke University. I can't write a line of code or bootstrap a company like this guy. I didn't go to business school. You start focusing on all the gaps between what you don't have and what that particular founder has. You lose sight of a very important fact, which is there is no one pathway to founding a company. Everybody's pathway is completely different. Mine is almost unique. From the Supreme Court to a law partner to starting a cashback rewards app in the grocery space, this is not a common pathway. And it certainly wasn't common for any of these founders, and they all have their own things they have to overcome. But what I did was I started descending into trying to imitate aspects of that business. So instead of starting with a fresh piece of paper and thinking about what is it I want to build and why, and how's it going to help the world, I started thinking about, well, can I do something kind of like personal analytics and financial management like Mint? And that seems to be what gets acquired. And I didn't have any relationships in that space or any knowledge of that space. I don't know people at companies like Intuit. So I started to feel pretty discouraged by that and thinking, there's something wrong with me as a potential founder. I don't just wake up with 3 good ideas. And in fact, the ideas that I did have, I would travel through kind of a 4-day manic cycling period where I'd get really excited. I'd research it. I'd tell some people about it. I'd find out that other people were doing it. There's no business model. It's a terrible idea. And then I would repeat that cycle, up, down, up, down, up, down, until finally I would get more conviction in something. I would linger with that something, which ultimately became my company. I think a lot of of us grew up in an era of idolizing people who have outsized accomplishments. And we look, I like to recall the Gatorade commercials of my youth, the Be Like Mike. And a lot of presentations at Denver Startup Week or TED Talks are essentially what I like to call the Be Like Mike presentation, which is dun dun dun, ah, you should be more like me. You're sort of like, well, that'd be great, but how? And that's very scary and intimidating. And so what I like to think about this presentation is to shatter that idea a little bit and to demystify the process a little bit and create a little bit of encouragement for folks if they're feeling some of the things, same things that I not only felt, but continue to feel throughout this process. And one of my favorite analogies in describing this is what I like to call painting the bullseye. This is something that I learned from Justice Souter while I was his employee. And, this is something I think applies broadly to tech companies, but also the way people describe themselves on LinkedIn in every profession, the way a lawyer describes herself at a cocktail party. It's always the same. There's a fair amount of luck and circumstantial, this led to that in anybody's life or career progression. But we like to tell it in hindsight as though it was part of a thoughtful, planned process all the way along. And so the best way I know how to describe that is with this colorful analogy of painting the bullseye. So let me explain what I mean by that. So imagine that someone, say a startup founder, is firing aimlessly and randomly into the air with their best guess as to what might actually be a good idea. And the arrow hits where it hits. It happens to hit the side of a barn. Certainly they weren't aiming at the side of the barn, but that's where it happens to hit. Well, then under cover of darkness, the next thing they do is they paint the bullseye around wherever the arrow happened to land. And by morning, wouldn't you know it, they're showing off their incredible marksmanship to a crowd of people. And Justice Souter talked about how this is really a feature of the way people talk about their legal careers, but it's very much a feature of how people talk about founding a company. And then I had the insight that the advertising industry needed to be disrupted. And so I spoke with all these consumer packaged goods companies like Coca-Cola and Kellogg's, and immediately became clear to me that they needed a performance-based marketing solution that would work direct to consumer on a mobile device. And that's when we had the flux capacitor moment and we had this epiphany. Yeah, that's not how it worked. That's not how it ever works. And we do a certain form of violence to each other by retelling the story that way. And so I think it's better to tell the story in a completely different way, a way that is much more realistic and honest, even if it doesn't make you look like the next Edison. So this is a popular drawing some of you may have seen. This is by Paul Graham, and this describes the subjective well-being experience of a startup founder. So this is a chart that I think is very helpful because it's the y-axis is not financial performance, it's happiness. And then the x-axis there is the progression of the stages of your early stage startup. So it's the passage of time. So as you start out, before you have the startup, you're ebullient, you're optimistic, you're excited, you're going to take on the world, grab the world by the tail, tiger by the tail. You're so initially enthusiastic and you spike in happiness. None of the realities of your business model have really sunk in. And then slowly the realities are creeping up, and then boom, they sit in. Wow, our potential clients who we thought would buy this don't want to buy this. Wow, there's already 3 other companies doing this. I didn't even know that. I remember when I started my company, getting on the phone with a grocery retail company and so excited to tell them exactly about what we did. And they said, oh yeah, that's like Saving Star. And I said, well, I'm sorry, what was it? Saving Star? I'm not familiar with Saving Star. Oh yeah, they do exactly what you're describing. Oh, really? I mean, exactly? No, exactly. Huh. Cool. Well, anyway, we're different. I'll let you know later why we're different, but so reality sets in. The cost of everything is higher. Everything takes longer than you think it will to go your way. People are it's difficult to find talent. It's difficult to get things off the ground. You don't even realize what you don't know. Oh, wait a minute. We need $30,000 for insurance. I didn't even have that in the business plan. I didn't even know we needed insurance. Little things like that. And boom, pretty soon you start to become extremely overwhelmed and intimidated, and you enter the trough of sorrow. And the trough of sorrow involves a lot of experimentation, iteration, pivoting, starting to figure out how do I get some kind of product market fit here so I can salvage some shred of dignity and not have to fold this thing and sort of admit defeat and go back and ask for my law firm job back, for example, in my case. If you're lucky, and for many companies, it ends in the trough of sorrow. But if you're lucky, you find some small traction. It might be something completely different than where you thought you would find traction. but you start pursuing that, you get a little bit of momentum, and slowly your confidence rebuilds until you achieve something that could, reasonably be called product market fit. And now the traditional narrative is that you see what's called a hockey stick. So you see this kind of exponential happiness and growth curve, and we all ride off into the sunset. So the Graham framework is usually stops here at the experience of the early stage startup. But since I'm still running this company as a high growth CEO, I can tell you that the story continues beyond the early phases into what it's like to run a high growth company. And so the next phase is where you are in market with your product is taking off, your happiness is taking off because you're growing. Now people want to invest in your company, employees want to work for your company, it's less risky. You're starting to imagine the possibility of maybe one day selling your company or having an IPO and making money and thinking about the money your investors are going to make. And then an inconvenient thing happens, which is you enter the maturity or later stages of the growth of your first big idea. And when that happens, and it happens to every single company, then you have a choice. You can either bury your head in the sand and watch that slowly decline over time, or you can come up with your next big idea. The slowly decline with your head in the sand happens all the time. Think about Blockbuster Video. Think about Kodak. There are lots of examples of companies that just don't understand that what worked before is not going to indefinitely work. And I would argue every single company in the world, doesn't matter if it's Apple, Amazon, we're seeing it now with lots of big companies, for instance, like Meta, that thought they were going to be here forever with their business model. Well, they have to reinvent themselves or they eventually die. And that process of reinvention means you're always in something of a startup or reinvention mode. You are never sort of achieving that escape velocity of happiness that would be implied by the legendary mythical hockey stick. Now, maybe you hockey sticked and somebody bought your company and you were frozen in happiness. It's possible. But most of the time, if you continue running the company, you find that you're into this plateau and then you're worried about the loss of everything you've created because you've created expectations. People are relying on you. They came to your company for healthcare benefits. You've got hundreds of employees. And so you start to say, well, what's my next big idea? And the companies that have a great next big idea, like Amazon Web Services, for example, Amazon Ads, on they go. And the companies that don't, metaverse, for example, we'll see. And that is extremely stressful experience, no matter how much success you've had up to that point. So that's part of the experience. But the other thing that's important to note is that even the growth part is much less like an upward curve than is often described. If you pan in, zoom in, it's almost like looking at a DNA strand. There's a upward trending sine curve. So every single day is full of 5 amazing, encouraging, positive things that you talk about with your partner at the end of the day, and 3 terrifying, oh my God, this could go horribly wrong, and then what will we do? There's never just 5 straight days of 5 great things. It's always like 5 and 3, 3 and 5, 5 and 4. It's 2 steps forward, 1.5 steps back. Very bumpy ride. So that experience involves a lot of emotional vicissitudes, a lot of set shifting and disappointment and eucatastrophe. So it's a great Greek word. It means the euphoric relief you feel when an apparent catastrophe does not occur. So that's the positive side, right? You have catastrophe and eucatastrophe happening all the time. And no one really talks about this because they assume, oh, wow, you got funded in your Series B, you're fine. Oh, well, you're profitable, you're fine. No, the bumpy ride is very bumpy indeed. And you can read about this in lots of different places. And this is true of many different companies. So how many of you have read Ben Horowitz's book, The Hard Thing About Hard Things? Great book, one of my favorite books. Horowitz is a brilliant leader. He's part of Andreessen Horowitz. You may have heard of that, well-known venture firm and one of the co-founders there. But this book is about what it's like as what he calls a wartime CEO, when things are going exceptionally poorly, when you have a market like we do right now, when you're really up against it and you have weeks of cash left, when you have employees leaving, when you have to figure out something different, you have to try something totally different in order to survive, as distinct from, say, a peacetime CEO role, which he describes. And he describes these things called whiffios, the we're effed, it's over, WFIO, whiffio moments, and how many of those there are. And so a lot of succeeding as a wartime CEO is managing the whiffios without just bonking and collapsing and quitting. If you read Shoe Dog, which is the wonderful autobiography by the founder of Nike, Phil Knight, Shoe Dog is an incredible story of a company that up until the very, 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 very end of the company, there is always a possibility of its immediate demise. So you can be 30 years into reading, into the story of Nike, and there is still a possibility that if one inflection goes against them, if one ball bounces the wrong way, that they can go out of business and become bankrupt. And you say, well, wait, that's crazy. I mean, how is it that Nike, which is an internationally known, a household name brand, could still be on the verge of going out of business so quickly? That seems incredibly hard to believe. And yet one or two things go differently in 1980, and Michael Jordan is wearing Converse and not Nikes. So you really realize how long into the life of a company you face sort of existential threats to that company. And lastly, a great book that is about Netflix. And we talked about companies that reinvent themselves with the next big idea. Netflix is a great example of that. So you have a company that's taken over from the Blockbusters of the world with, its DVD model. For those of you who are too young, used to put a little thing into a slip of a sleeve and put it in the US mail. And then another little thing would come out and you put it on your DVD player. Anyway, that was a juggernaut business. And what it took to completely destroy and disrupt that business and replace it with the next business in online streaming was an enormous amount of facing down the fear, self-doubt, and external doubt and self-criticism that came from, well, why can't my original business carry us the distance? And really owning up to that and managing that anxiety in the face of some difficult circumstances. This is an example of a quote by a well-known observer, John Tobey, who is a graduate of the Stanford Business School and a commentator who wrote about that decision by Netflix contemporaneously. He said, Netflix made a major, irreversible mistake. The lost DVD rental revenues and customers cannot be regained. Have they made themselves the go-to place for video streaming? Probably not. It certainly doesn't seem to be a good long-term buy. So now we laugh, and that's ridiculous. But at the time, there were 1,000 of these commentators, making it very difficult to be a public company, to justify taking the bold decisions that Reed and the team needed to take. So our modern day equivalent of this is Glassdoor. Glassdoor is basically a professional defamation website. It's a place where people can go and anonymously say and do whatever they want about their leaders. And look, there are benefits to it. And the irony is I won an award from Glassdoor, but I don't ever go there. I actually have it blocked on my cell phone. It's a blocked website. It's blocked on my laptop. And that's because it's mean. It's mean and it just tears people down. And it's a place where if you spend any time at all, you will just feel all the worst parts of doing this job. So we aggregate information from there so we can learn, if there are trends, we want to obviously take the constructive part of it. But a lot of the personal ad hominem attack is very corrosive when you're in the role of the founder and you built this company, it's your baby, and people are telling you your baby is ugly and also telling you that you're a horrible parent. That's a very bad place to go, and very bad for mental health. I don't know if there's a worse website for mental health for founders on the planet. It's probably #1 worst website. And you can tell I really love this company. I'll tell you a funny story about it, though. Recently, a good friend of mine, John Levisay, who's the CEO of a wonderful company here in Colorado called the Pros Closet, and who was the founder himself of a company called Craftsy, he called me up and said, I was on Glassdoor the other day, and it was just brutal. I was getting just savaged on there. And so to cheer myself up, I went on, I looked at all the reviews about you, Bryan, and it made me feel so much better. I said, that's great, John. Thank you very much. Please don't tell me what they were because I have it blocked on my phone for a reason. So the point I think it comes down to is that a lot of people talk about how your brilliance, your determination, your hard work is the main driver of your level of success. And I'm not denying those are important factors, but I think the central argument that I would make here is that more than you realize, your success is actually dependent on your level of mental and emotional resilience. And so the ability to absorb and show up the next day, the ability not to say, forget it, it's just too much, just to ride out one more cycle, just to give you one more chance to see if maybe it will turn a corner and get better, is probably what separates people who make it in some sense from those who don't. as much as their native intelligence. And I think we focus a lot on kind of the thinking brain, if you will, and we don't focus as much on the emotional side of our brain and our emotional maturity, our limbic system, et cetera, which I think I've come to respect a lot more as I've gone through the rigors of my job. So we know that startups are stressful. Just statistically, there was a recent survey. It was the third most stressful occupation. The first two were actually lawyer and doctor. And so since I used to be a lawyer and I'm married to a doctor, we have all three covered in my family, all three. But third was entrepreneurs. And you compare it to a baseline of non-entrepreneurs at 48%. 72% of entrepreneurs experience mental health challenges. Very few of them talk about it openly. And there's obviously different degrees. In my case, the stress of my job manifests in physical forms. So I will have tinnitus, for example, or I'll have chest pain, or I'll have wrist pain, or I will experience some other symptom, plantar fasciitis. The stress finds the weak part of your body and lets you know that your check engine light is on. And that is both great because it's a warning sign and extremely sobering and debilitating. And so that is my version of that. But for everybody, there's a different version of how that manifests and how they deal with it. I'll talk a little bit about how I've learned how to deal with it. So I think it comes down to managing your emotions when you are, for good reasons, from an evolutionary perspective, you are afraid. So anybody rock climbers in the crowd here? We're in Colorado, a couple of rock climbers. So by state constitution, we have to use only mountain and rock climbing analogies in this presentation. But this is a rock climbing analogy, and it's basically inherently frightening when you're leading a route, when you're in conditions that are getting worse. For example, a lot of how successful you are and whether you can reach the top of that pitch has nothing to do with your raw climbing ability in terms of your technical ability. And it's more to do with how you manage your emotions when you're on the wall. And I think it's very similar when you're starting a company. But to do that, I think you have to understand the origins of anxiety and stress in a startup. And so I've come up with this 2x2 framework. I think I invented this, I don't know, but I'll show you how it works and why I think it's a helpful guide for me. And I think maybe for other folks who are experiencing some of the same emotions and don't understand the root causes. So this is a basic framework where you can think about how much control you have over a situation and also how much you're emotionally invested in the outcome in that situation. So you can think about there's kind of 4 different quadrants here. How much do I control? How much do I care in each quadrant? And I'll illustrate this so you can get the hang of it. So let's start with the Denver Broncos. I don't care that much how they do. I care a small amount. And I have no control over how they perform. So it doesn't much affect my life one way or the other. It doesn't cause me a tremendous amount of anxiety because the stakes are too low. If I really, really cared, the fact that I didn't have control might bother me more, but it's a minor thing in my life. Let's take what I had for breakfast this morning. I have a ton of control over that, and it doesn't really matter. So it doesn't trouble me at all. Now it gets into more interesting territory. Let's suppose where I send my children to school. Now I really care about my kids getting into and going to a great school so they have opportunities in life like the ones I've had. And I have a fair degree of control over that. I can help shape them, influence their decisions, help them apply to that school, what have you. They have a fair degree of control. I can choose to live in this or that school district, to be in this or that public school. And indeed, my wife and I did that so our kids could go to the right public school when they were kids. So we had a lot of control. It was not something that generated terribly much anxiety. But then you get this other quadrant, which is the anxiety quadrant. I care a ton about the outcome. I'm really emotionally invested in it. And I perceive myself to have a limited degree of control, much less than I would like. So take the example of turbulence on an airplane. I hate turbulence on an airplane. Heavy turbulence, what they call medium turbulence. That's my version of heavy turbulence, by the way. I hate it. Every time you land in Denver, they say, flight attendants, take your seats. And then they tell the passengers, this is going to be horrible. And you go, oh God, not again. And they do it every single time. And it feels horrible every single time to me. Why? Because I don't want to die and I'm not flying the plane. I have no control and the stakes are really high. So I'm very uncomfortable. I perceive based on, what's going on that we might fall out of the sky and I can't stop it. So anxiety, try it out. This works all across your life, not just in your professional life. And in a startup, we have what I like to call the myth of control. So when I was becoming an entrepreneur, this is going to be great. Look at all the control. Finally, I get to control my own work culture. I'll set the values of the place. I'll determine, what we celebrate and who gets rewarded, and I'll remedy all the things I didn't like about my old workforce, right? And I get to decide who I hire. At the end of the day, I bring in the people. I can let go of people. I'm in control. And then there's my schedule. I don't have a boss. I work for myself. I can show up, not show up wherever I want, whenever I want. All I have to do is think about the board meetings 4 times a year. This is great. So much control. Product roadmap. I have the final say over that. What are we going to prioritize? What's our strategy? How are we going to do it? Strategy, product roadmap. These are all within my control. So yeah, I care a lot, but I got so much control. Well, actually, when you go through the experience, what you're going to find is that you've unlocked a whole lot of areas of your life that you have no control over whatsoever, that maybe weren't really on your radar before you started the company. So now you have all these other people with personalities, expectations, limitations who are on your board, your investors, and you don't control their reaction, their emotional reaction. They may berate you in front of your peers. They may call for this or that change in the way you're running the company. Usually not, but it can happen. Your competitors, their whole purpose is to put you in the ground. It's to put you out of business. It's to take away all the jobs of all of your employees, to take away all their healthcare, to take away their livelihood, to take away their 401k. That's their job. And this is capitalism. This is a contact sport. So we're trying to do it to them and they're trying to do it to us. And it's rough and tumble and we don't control the moves they make. One day you're going to wake up and, they formed this incredible partnership. And how do they outflank us there? And oh my goodness, they sold for this. And why did we think of that? That's all part of your new world as a startup founder. Then there's the drama that occurs every single day in that you have people. HR is a people business. So things happen in the ecosystem of your company. We've had people tragically die who've been employees of Ibotta. We've had people who've had, crazy things happen in the workplace, for example, that were way out of my control. And it's damage control and it's managing the fallout. Of course, we have other stakeholders who want you to give them their money back, want you to go public. You're always on the time clock. And you don't have control over the macro economy. Right now, we're living through capital markets that say your company's worth 1/3 of what it was a year ago. That's totally out of your control. And emotionally, that feels horrible because you were sort of, I built this thing. It's about worth this. And then all of a sudden, boom, it's worth this. Or I'm ready to go public. I've done all this work for 7, 12, whatever months. And no, you can't. You can't go public. Sorry, the airport's closed. No takeoffs from the runway right now. What? Well, when's that changing? I don't know. We'll have to wait and see what the Fed does. I didn't even put the Fed on this, right? They're part of the macro economy. You got clients, thousands of them. You got pressures in your own life around, liquidity and wanting to have a good exit for your investors. And then totally exogenous events like a pandemic where suddenly you can't come to work anymore and you have no experience working remotely and you've got a huge office that you're paying for with nobody in it half the time. Didn't factor on that. Or you have a supply chain disruption that affects your clients. So there's all these things that are now suddenly outside of your control. And in fact, your job is to constantly give away control. If you're doing it right, the bigger your company gets, the fewer and fewer things you directly control. So when I started Ibotta, I ran all the things you see on the screen. I was the head lawyer. I was the head product officer. I ran the people function. I did the hiring, everything except for the chief technology. I had somebody, Luke, who helped me with that. But every other thing, I basically had a hand in and had an active say in. So I could go home and go, okay, all right, I got my hand on the rudder, my finger in the dike of Western civilization, as my old boss used to say, Judge Cabranes. Well, this is good. Delegating is important. You can't continue to manage every single aspect, but what it means is the trust required in your role is only going up, and you're having to put things that you care about into the hands of other people. It's like when your older daughter is driving your younger daughter and you're not in the car. Very scary. Not an experienced driver, 2 people you love very much, scary. And of course, they're pushing responsibility down even further to their direct reports and employees. So now you have this lack of control, but you also care more than you ever did before. And I'm not saying I didn't care about my clients when I was a lawyer. I did. But at the end of the day, it's their problem. I'm rendering a professional service and I get paid whether they win or lose, by and large. I'm a partner. I have tenure. I make money. and on we go. I have another 10 clients next year. When it's your venture, it's not like that. If you're down in the dumps, you're facing that every single day. There's no escape from that. It's not like when the Pelicans lose in overtime and you have a bad taste in your mouth, but then they play 48 hours later and you can forget about it. It's the only thing you think about. And you do what a psychologist might call merger. And this is to say you emotionally merge with the entity. So your sense of self-worth and self-esteem becomes wrapped up in the performance of your company. So it becomes harder and harder to separate yourself from your company. So I'm a good person intrinsically. I have these qualities that I'm proud of, even though my company went, right? Because that just feels like a referendum on who you are, because it's an extension of yourself. It's not healthy, but it's very commonplace. And so you have this merger. So now you care a lot, you're losing control, and that leads to a lot of potential anxiety as you're facing down all these stakeholders that you have in your world. And so to put it back in the framework of the 2x2 matrix, starting out as a law partner, I certainly cared more than a little bit, had a fair degree of perceived control. I decide what to file. I decide what evidence to put in the record. I decide what witnesses to put on the stand and what questions to ask. I write the brief. To, okay, I'm a startup founder. I still have a fair bit of control. It's the early stages. I'm building my own desk, got my fingers in a lot of pies, certainly care a lot. But then you get into the high growth stage later on, you delegate away a lot by necessity of a lot of other factors that are outside of your control. And now you're in the kind of anxiety red zone. I found that it ramped a lot as I moved from startup founder into growth stage CEO. So I want to give you a few examples of how this manifests and the kinds of things that you deal with as a startup founder. And every company is different, but I just like to share a few concrete stories so you can relate to the lived experience of the early days of a company like this. This is one of the early stories. So we have a company where you take a picture of a receipt and you get cash back. At least that's how it worked in the early days most of the time. And we had a situation where in the early days, we hadn't figured out how to prevent people from cheating the system by printing out duplicate receipts or manipulating the receipts so they could just collect money. And we only had a few dollars in the bank. We were really close to the edge, and we wake up one day and there's a $10,000 hole in our bank account. Going, what happened? Well, it turns out this one user had figured out that she could just do this game, and it was taking thousands and thousands of dollars out of the company. And it was our first experience with fraud. And we freaked out. I felt like someone was stealing out of the back of my house. It felt like it wasn't like a business expense. Oh, ordinary cost of business. No. It felt like armed robbery. So what do? We contacted the user. By email, I wrote an email using my lawyer persona and said, we're working with the federal authorities and the FBI. We know where you live and we're coming to get you, basically. As it happened, that user was a University of Kansas undergraduate, KU undergraduate, who happened to be in Colorado, I think was originally from Colorado. And she and her friend were just messing around. And they didn't realize, what it would lead to. It's like a war game situation, if you know that movie. And so we said, well, tell you what, if you want to make it right, meet us at the corner of Blake and 16th, and we'll put the money back into our account. So me and like 10 other people, so I didn't get knifed, went down to the corner of downtown Denver and met these two terrified 20-year-old kids, walked into Wells Fargo, up to the teller and was like, this girl stole $10,000 from me. She's putting it back in my account, and I'm not leaving till you confirm it's in my account. She's signing back the money as fast as she can. Are we good? We're not going to jail? No, it's good. See ya. But that's just an example of how much fear and terror and what was at stake. And that's how you know you're alive as well. So the flip side of vulnerability is that you value something. If you don't value something, or it doesn't matter that much to you, what's the point? What's the point? That was how I felt about being a law partner. But as soon as you value something, you become vulnerable, because if it doesn't go well, you care about the loss of it. And so you open yourself up by definition by starting something to that feeling of fear and disappointment, and it'll motivate you to great heights. Another example, a couple of years into our company, I get this notice in the email, and it says that we're being sued in a class action lawsuit. And it says that every time we sent a text message, we violated the Telephone Consumer Protection Act. And every violation for every single text message that we sent is worth $500 of penalty. So I wander over to Luke, our chief technology officer, and I'm like, hey, how many text messages have we sent out recently? He's somewhere between 10 and 50 million. Right. 10 million times 500. Interesting. That's a problem. We are going out of business, and I can't believe it's because of this legal foot fault that we know about. Well, it turns out we didn't violate the Telephone Consumer Protection Act. We weren't robo-texting people. It just appeared that way to the recipient of one of the texts. And so we settled the case for $1,000. But for about 2.5 weeks, I was in complete panic mode, figuring that I'd have to go back to all the investors and tell them what legal thing I had screwed up that cost us all their money, and it was all gone. It's gone, right? South Park style. I did not want to have the conversation about how all their money was gone. And we were lucky that we avoided it. And then, of course, more recently, you have the pandemic. Many of you were here. I stood right where I am right now, and I told people, just leave your things at your desk. We'll be back in 10 to 14 days. We're just going to do a little flattening of the curve. We'll be right back. After these messages, we'll be right back. And we're still not back in the same sense, and we never will be, I don't think, to where we were now almost 3 years ago. So these things happen, and riding with them, rolling with these punches, emotional resiliency, and finding some solace in it is essential. So what is it that can help? It's inevitable to some extent, especially if you're wired to be an anxious achiever like me. You're going to feel it. You're going to really feel it. If you don't like letting people down, if you always want to exceed expectations, you're setting yourself up, because this is a profession where you will let yourself and others down from time to time, and you will fall short of your expectations. So you're definitely going to experience some of these unpleasant emotions. And so the question is, how do you sit with that and manage through that? And these are some of the things I've learned. We mentioned rock climbing. So to go back to the rock climbing idea, this is Tommy Caldwell. He's a friend of mine, friend of the company's, and probably the greatest living free climber in the world right now. You may have seen him in the Dawn Wall, or he's in Free Solo and many other things. He holds the speed record on El Capitan. Anyway, in talking to Tommy about this, he describes something a lot of climbers feel who do multi-pitch outdoor climbing, which is the emotions of what happens when the wind picks up, the emotions of what happens when there's snowfall, icefall, rockfall, a bird in a crack. Something happens that's unexpected, or you get to a blank section of rock and you can't figure out how you're going to get up that next pitch, and you're stuck there and you can't wrap down from that position. And there's only one way off the rock, which is up, especially if you're doing it without a rope, but he does it with a rope, thankfully. Still, it can feel like, gosh, I don't want to take a 100 or 200 foot fall here, so I got to figure this out. So it's about focusing on the very small 5-foot area right around you. It's about focusing on the next 3 holds and really telescoping your focus into that present moment. But what makes that hard as an entrepreneur, and people say, oh yeah, stay in the present. That's a good tip. Cognitive behavioral therapy, stay in the present. I heard that somewhere. Yeah, it's important advice. And our job is to not stay in the present. Our job is to imagine the future, plan for the future, describe scenarios, inspire partners, clients, investors, board members by promising or painting a picture of something that will happen. So you can't just stay in the present. You can't avoid future thinking. You can avoid looking back and reconstructing the past, but the hypothesized future is part of your reality as a startup founder. So you have to figure out how to do that part of your job and also come back to the present. It's also true that you're going to raise your own expectations no matter whether you like it or not. So somebody might come in and say, I want to buy your company. You have an obligation as the CEO or the founder to go try to talk them into doing that at a good price. And then you get all excited and your partner says, what happened today? Oh, so-and-so is thinking about buying the company. Really? Yeah, I think it's a long shot, but and then no matter how many times you say, I think it's a long shot, somewhere in your heart, it lodges as, man, that'd be cool. Let's see if that might happen. That'd be really cool. And then when it doesn't, you feel disappointed, crestfallen, sad, and maybe even blame yourself. And that's not avoidable because of the nature of your job. That's what you signed up for. And so it's about figuring out how not to bonk when that inevitably happens. And part of that for me is avoid shitting on yourself, as I like to call it. And this is something I work a lot on with my therapist. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, but Should and shouldn't are words that enter our vocabulary all the time. Maybe you don't like what you ate today. Maybe you don't like the way you look in those clothes. Maybe you don't like the way you showed up in that public presentation, or the way you use too much verbal junk like and and right. There's a million ways, micro ways you can criticize yourself all the time. And usually it runs through a word like should or shouldn't. I should have done this. I shouldn't have done that. I should have known better. And those words, I try to stop myself as soon as I hear them enter my brain and go, shitting on yourself again. Stop, because it's hard. What you're doing is hard, and you don't have perfect information. You're going to make mistakes. And so you have to find a system or rubric for insisting on self-compassion in the moment where you're about to beat yourself up. Very difficult to do, but if you're aware of it, it's like being aware of verbal junk in public speaking. You can avoid it more often. Don't be a super founder. So this is one of the biggest problems with founding a company is you assume a persona. You play a role, the role of the person who has their shit all figured out. And not only that, but knows what the company needs to do and what the next, opportunity is. And you're sort of in touch with God. You've received the tablets and you're just communicating them out to the assembled masses. That is, of course, totally not true. And everybody knows that's not true. But you still put on this armor. You still put on this persona because it doesn't feel safe to share all of your insecurities, fears, and vulnerabilities because it freaked people out. And there's a degree of truth to that. If I came up at the town hall and said, oh my God, what are we going to do next? People are like, put my CV out on Indeed, right? That's what we're going to do next. So you can't necessarily share everything that's going on in your interior dialogue, but you also want to be relatable and encourage other people to help solve the problem instead of putting it all on your own shoulders. So resisting the temptation to inhabit the super founder is something I've worked and struggled with a lot over the last decade. But there's an alternative. And I like to lay this out and build a fun acronym around it. So see if you can guess the acronym. The first is you highlight the problem explicitly. You look for opportunities to highlight the problem. We're facing a problem with activation. We're facing a problem with retention. We can't get a low enough cost per acquisition of our users. We're seeing a competitive landscape that's getting tighter. Whatever it is, blurt it out. Just say it. Highlight it. Draw attention to it. Don't try to hide it. Big mistake that founders make is when they go to their early board meetings, they're still selling their board members that they belong, that they know what they're doing as the CEO and the founder. They don't highlight problems because they figure if I highlight problems, they might say, this guy seems to be a CEO of a company with a lot of problems. Wonder what that says about this CEO. Maybe we should swap him out. So you steer away from the problems instead of trusting yourself, having the security to say, this is our problem. Big learning for me from the first few years. So secondly, not enough to say there's a problem. If you then say, and I have the solution, you're right back in the same pickle. But so the second is you openly admit that you do not have the answer. You might have a theory, you might have a hypothesis, you might have a discussion in which you have a bunch of different ideas, but you don't have the definitive answer. You're going to test a hypothesis at most. Welcoming other opinions. So as a founder, very often I have learned that a success is something that everybody shares. You deflect the praise. Oh, I want to thank the whole team. We got this major deal with Walmart. It's great. It's because of this person, this person, this person. And then when you tell the board, I want to thank our team for the hard work. But when there's a problem or a failure, it's your problem. You internalize that and wear that, and that's 100% on you. And you're the leader, and you should have known. And now part of the way you get rid of that is you make everything our problem as well as our success. And the way you do that is you have to welcome other opinions. You can't just say a problem, say you don't know the answer, and be like, well, that's the end of it. You have to then enlist other people so that they feel emotionally invested. And your vulnerability will draw them in and want to work harder with you to solve the problem. And it will take the pressure off of you when shit goes terrible, which it inevitably will. Listen. So you can invite other opinions, but you can't be talking. Every time you're talking, you're not learning. You cannot learn while you're talking. You can only learn while you're listening. So you have to learn how to listen, not just formulaic, procedural, oh yeah, tick the box, everybody went around, heard some opinions. Listen, change your opinions, incorporate other people's ideas, try them out. When you do that, it creates a sense of shared responsibility, and it encourages entrepreneurial thinking from more than just the founder in the org. And this isn't just true in the early days, it's true even in a 800-person company like ours today. So instead of being the super founder, howl. Part of this is also about understanding who you are. In graduate school and undergraduate, I never once understood my leadership style or how I showed up in group settings, ever. For all the work I did, and I have a master's degree, I have a law degree, all that work, I never really understood what my gaps were in terms of how I tended to show up in group settings. So this is a framework called DISC. It's one of many. I'm right at the top of the green and the red, at the very top of the circle, dominant, influential, influencer. And I'm not strong on C and S. And so understanding that means you know how you're going to operate around other people who are C or S, how they process information, how they like to make decisions, how they react to a person who's a DI personality. That has led to coaching around this. It's led to actively working to combat habits that a DI person like myself will have in a room. So for instance, purposely drawing other people out in conversation, purposely allowing a day of thought so people can get their ideas together and gather their thoughts instead of necessarily wanting to play the Socratic method game with me, because I like to do that right on the spot, trained as a trial lawyer. Understanding that there are a lot of valid forms of leadership style that don't necessarily resemble your own, and making space for that. And then understanding how your leadership wake operates as a founder. So you're going to go in there and you're going to say something and people are going to go, well, that's the gospel because the founder said it. And if you don't actively counteract that mythology, it will grow up around you and it will lead you right back into some of the problems of anxiety I mentioned earlier. Draw support from other founders. So you sometimes can't talk to your employees about things like this. You can only talk to other founders who go through the same thing. So right now I'm texting back and forth all the time with friends of mine whose companies are getting hammered in the stock market. And I'm just there for them. I'm so sorry. This must be so hard. How are you doing? This is tough. I'll probably send this presentation to them because they need that. And in moments where I'm in the same spot, I need to hear from them and we need to support each other. And it's something that men in particular are very bad at. But I think over time, this generation, people are getting better at it. And it's reciprocal. And so it feels like a balanced thing. But you can't just make withdrawals. You also have to make deposits in this. That's the benefit of investing in relationships with other founders. If you can not be feeling insecure around them because of their achievements, and you can be genuinely happy for them, even when you're not doing well, then you'll have that as a support when you need it. And then there's finding a good therapist. And this is something I spend a lot of time talking about at my company. When I started out in the law, you couldn't have a therapist. You certainly couldn't talk about it because you're getting paid $1,000 an hour to be right. And if you got issues, no one's going to make you a partner. No one wants to pay you $1,000, $2,000. So you keep that to yourself. Started out with a coach. A coach, in my view, is basically a starter therapist. So if you're not comfortable saying you have a therapist, start out with a coach. Everybody has a coach. I'm just a player on the team that needs to get a little better against right-handed pitching. What? I got a coach. Right? It's a societally accepted therapist. For me, coaching was the gateway into realizing, wow, I really need a constant avenue to talk about how I feel, the anxieties that I'm dealing with, run through and feel those emotions. Part of what I thought from the way I grew up and was trained is that a great leader is emotionally detached, like almost like a Buddhist concept. Like you're able to observe dispassionately those feelings that are kind of coming across the transom and you note them, but then you just move on and you kind of put them in a hurt locker and let them self-detonate and move on. That's one thing that works for some people. What I found is a more effective and that I've worked a lot on in my weekly therapy is steering into the emotions that you're feeling, purposely having a rage session. I will go and have a 30-minute rage session where no one can hear me in my car on the highway without my dog in the back because it frightens her. And I will just scream about the things that are bothering me, get it completely out, completely to a point where you've emotionally processed and accepted it. It's a catharsis. And then it's dealt with. Whether it's fear, whether it is jealousy, guilt, shame, anger, all those are emotions that if you don't explicitly stare them down and allow yourself to feel those are valid, and then you ask yourself, what do I need to do? What actions do I need to take in the light of that feeling. If you can do that, in my world anyway, you can achieve a then equanimity where you can show back up to work and those things aren't creeping out or sublimating in meetings you have with other people, where your own failure to scoop out that toxicity in yourself is showing up in how other people interact with you and how they feel about their job. Then you're not modeling for them what they need to do either. And this also is a male problem. It's a male founder problem. It's not just for those two groups of people, but it's especially bad because of societal stigma associated with mental health. If you are on, until very recently here in Colorado, if you're on antidepressant medication and you're a doctor, you have to report that to your medical society. It's absurd. Why would you have to do that? The implication is that there's something unstable or wrong, or that, maybe you shouldn't be caring for patients. Completely wrong way of thinking about these things. And as I've learned more about all of these topics, have chosen to speak much more publicly about them, because I think it gives everybody else a permission structure to do what they need. And that takes me to my last point, which is normalize self-care. So these are things that we do as a company. This is a letter that I wrote to my company here, in which I pointed out that mental health care is not a sign of weakness, that you should find a great therapist or counselor that will pay for it, but that if it's bothering you, you can remain anonymous if you would like to. We won't know about it. It's very easy to find someone. Here are some websites and resources you can go to. It's something that we will actually pay for entirely out of our benefits package, but you have to constantly say it. You have to say it in groups of other founders. You have to say it in groups of employees. It's something that I think is really shifting in our views, but people in leadership positions, I think, have a special obligation to normalize it and talk about it publicly. So with that, thank you very much. Hope you got something out of this. I appreciate your time and attention.